The snow stopped falling the next morning. Our squad fell in. In our winter outfits, we made a smart-looking group. We wore stretch trousers and white anoraks with black epaulets and the emblem of the Gebirgsjäger on the right sleeve. This distinctive insignia was an Edelweiss on a black oval badge. We had slung furs around our waists, which we would need under the skis on our way back up. Despite the deep snow, we were at once engaged in a wild race toward the Jenner Alm, an alpine pasture where the mules were stationed and which was about halfway down. The first to arrive was Stricker, who later on was to be my faithful, reliable No. 2 machine gunner. He was a sturdy farmer's son from South Tyrol, with a shock of hair as yellow-white as the mane of a Haflinger pony from his home pastures. He was by far the wildest of us on skis and the most experienced. From the Jenner Alm, the way was less steep, and we arrived safely at the lake. There were 2 hours to go before we would meet at our base in the village to pick up the provisions and start back to our station. We found the village deep in fresh snow. Going along the lake, we were already passing hotels now serving as KLV camps, for we could see the children and their leaders in Jungmadel uniform. I left the others and inquired about Christina. I had been in and out of almost all the places without success when I suddenly stood before her, face to face, on the village street. I had to say, "Hello, Christina," before she recognized me. Amazed, her face lit up with joy. When we kissed, she said, quite exasperated, "What on earth are you doing here?" I told her, and she said she had arrived here only 1 week ago and now was on duty. So there was nothing I could do but walk her back to her hotel, where I met 2 of her teammates and her superior, a girl of 18. There was no time left for the 2 of us, except for a cup of coffee in the kitchen. Children ran about noisily as in an elementary school. I was able to watch her handle the gang of little girls, which she did with firm ease, a new and endearing side of her that beguiled my heart even more. Walking back to our base in the village, I was not disappointed with the brevity of our meeting. What else could we expect in these days? Was it not a lucky coincidence to have met at all in this remote corner of Germany? At the base, we stuffed our rucksacks full of fresh food, among others a special Bavarian sausage that was part of the high-altitude ration. And when we began our ascent back to the station, I kept thinking of all the girls who were on duty so far away from home. For all their cheerfulness and charm, there was little girlishness about them, but instead a self-confident, matter-of-fact way in their manner, reflecting the unusual responsibility with which they were entrusted at an early age. That was the last time I saw Christina. 2 months later, she wrote that she was assigned to another camp far away in Austria in the province of Styria. Up on the ridge, our training program continued for several more weeks. Looking back, my impression is that we and our instructors were a team. They wanted us to become highly proficient soldiers, acting with others in small groups on our own. Knowing how to survive, not only in combat, but also in a hostile wilderness, and moving about in difficult terrain with vigour, circumspection, and in particular speed. Our exercises, therefore, had a distinctly athletic touch, a training for winners in regions where heavy weapons and armoured vehicles were of no use. The notion of the Waffen-SS as politically or racially indoctrinated fanatics, driven by party ideology and hate, was, in my experience, far from reality. Our training was focused on preparation for victory in modern warfare, and all of us were volunteers who wanted just that kind of preparation. Yes, we did feel a bit different from other parts of the armed forces, but this fact was true of many other units too, such as the Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions, and the Fallschirmjäger, or paratroops. In the Waffen-SS, the officers did not belong to a different class. They were picked from among the best seasoned soldiers who had shown leadership qualities in combat. Officers were not to be addressed as Sir, but with their rank only. It was the same with the NCOs. There was the special military salute of ours, not the right hand to the cap, but the right arm raised at eye level. In practice, however, the arm wasn't quite stretched, but rather casually raised as to avoid conformity with the party salute. Some regulations were in sharp contrast to those of the army, such as those regarding rations, which were equal for officers and men, or regarding lockers in the barracks. In the army, an unlocked locker meant 3 days in the guardhouse. In the Waffen-SS, it was the opposite way around. The very thought of a soldier stealing or touching his comrade's belongings was completely incompatible with our code of honour. The company returned to the barracks in the valley by the middle of April. Descending the other side of the ridge, opposite the Königssee, we experienced the sudden transition from winter to spring so common in the mountains. As the long single file of men and mules walked down the narrow path to the valley, suddenly, halfway down, the snow cover ended abruptly, melted away by the alpine sun. From under the snow's fringe, green meadows with hundreds of primulas, gentians, and other spring flowers had already come to full blossom. During our time down in the barracks, the company would march to the firing range once a week, quite a distance. We would depart at dawn and walk over the hills between the Salzach and Berchtesgaden. We would arrive just in time to wake up the residents of the narrow streets with our battalion's song, Wie ist die Welt so groß und weit und voller Sonnenschein. Many a face, ugly from sleep or lovely as the morning, would appear from behind the green shutters that opened as we marched through the little town. Our commander, on horseback, politely responded to the salutes and salutations from some of the windows. In the afternoon, on our way back, we crossed Berchtesgaden once more, singing, yodeling, and showing off our cheerful, disciplined unit. Upon entering the hills east of the town, however, we would form a single file again, take off our caps, roll up the sleeves of our tunics, and slowly climb the winding, steep ascent. This march was, once more, part of our physical conditioning, especially in summer when the sun heated up the hillside all afternoon. Then the unique beauty of the surrounding area would soon become irrelevant, and grinding uphill, our eyes would be fixed on our hobnail boots as they ground step by step into the trail's white limestone. Tired from the day's strain, we would think of a decent meal and of stretching out on our bunks. Passing the Berghof on the Obersalzberg, our attention would be diverted for a short while from the monotonous pace. We hoped to catch a glimpse of something important, appropriate to the importance of the place, although the Führer's residence was bypassed in a wide arc and could be seen only from afar. What we actually could see were the SS guards, outposts in black uniforms, black helmets, polished boots, submachine guns, and so forth. They were strangely different, this old guard, with their sinister, awe-inspiring look. Here was the seat of ultimate power, of ultimate responsibility for our country's course through this war. It was the place where the highest representatives of the European powers had come to parley, the place where the Führer sought to relax from his ascetic and focused life, to know all that amounted to the atmosphere of awe that surrounded the Berghof. There were exercises far more demanding than our homeward trek, such as ascending the Untersberg, the massif towering over the city of Salzburg. We took off at dawn toward a hamlet south of the city. We carried no heavy gear, just rifles. At the hamlet, however, our rucksacks were filled with potatoes, supply for the station on the mountain peak, £35 for each of us, which was quite something given that 1,300 metres of altitude had to be conquered along a horizontal distance of only 2 kilometres. The first quarter of our way up was normal strain, the potatoes on our backs seeming heavier and heavier. The second quarter became steeper as we turned toward a huge wall above us, yet we carried on with long steps at a steady pace. Some of us experienced difficulty on this part of the way. Our company commander, coming up from the rear and guiding his horse by the rein, noticed a man behind me panting and barely keeping pace. He approached him as a coach would do. "Come on, soldier, you can do it. Let me take your rifle for a while. I'll be back soon to see how you are doing." With that, he slung the rifle over his shoulder and passed on at a quicker pace than ours, nimbly using his stick and guiding his horse at the same time. Halfway up, we paused. The commander's orderly was to return from here with the horse and take those with him who seemed unfit to make it up the wall. Pride forbade any of us to report sick, but the commander singled out a few whom he considered to be not in adequate shape for the climb. We then started for the wall, first crossing scree that seemed to bleed away the strength we had left with each stride of poor foothold on the loose gravel. Then, before assailing the rock, we paused again to build up strength for the last and most difficult stretch. The rock was fairly well prepared for climbing. The path was, at some stretches, hewn into the stone itself. Higher up, though, an irregular flight of steps began, huge steps, impossible for us to master, carrying 35 pounds of potatoes and our gear on our backs, without pulling ourselves up by the ropes fastened along the steps. This last part of the climb turned out to be the ultimate athletic performance of our training course. We were sweating, panting, cursing, and yet doggedly pulling ourselves up the steps one by one. Eventually, the men ahead and above me, one after another, disappeared over the edge. Only a few more steps, a last effort, and it would be done. Then, standing there on the flat, slightly sloped roof, seeing the lodge only 100 metres away, I fainted. My knees began to give, the sky started to whirl, and I collapsed. The spell lasted only a short moment, a fit of altitude sickness that did not spoil the unequalled joy of the mountaineer who made it to the top. The landlady, grateful for the potato supply, rewarded us with a hearty meal. The descent 2 hours later followed an easier route. As soon as we reached the forest, we took the most direct way down. Rifles slung around the neck and resting across the breast, firmly gripped by both hands, we cut all corners of the winding serpentine path in wide downward leaps, and eventually assembled at the hamlet within less than half an hour. Down there we laughed at each other's uncontrollably shaking knees. That event marked the end of our training course. The tempo slowed. There was time and strength left for trips to Salzburg. Exploring this city and going to concerts added much to the wonderful time of my military training around Salzburg and Berchtesgaden. At that time, however, our training company received an assignment that was quite apart from our training program, namely 1 week's guard duty at a labour camp with about 50 inmates. Our duty was limited to guarding the enclosure. 2 guards had to walk around the outside of the perimeter fence for 2-hour reliefs. It was a dull, tiresome duty which we performed with less than full enthusiasm, as we felt it was beneath our dignity. Within the camp were a few huts, wooden structures with bunks. The military discipline with which the camp was run corresponded, as far as we could see, to the tidiness with which the whole place was kept. Except for the sick, the inmates used to leave for work early in the morning and return for supper. The camp kitchen, a small shack with a field stove under an awning, was in a corner of the compound, immediately adjacent to the fence. The cook stayed in during the day. He was a huge, middle-aged man, bull-necked with thick muscles on his arms and chest, which he kept bare on warm days, and which was, like his bald head, deeply tanned. I watched him working with deft motions, cleaning, maintaining the fire under the kettle, each day preparing different stews, often cutting thick slabs of meat into it, a remarkable thing at that time of general rationing. Apparently he took no notice of me. Likewise, I avoided showing him that I found him a figure of some interest. But on my last day of duty there in the afternoon, he approached me without turning from his work. "It's your last day with us, isn't it?" "Well, yes, that's right. How did you know?" I replied, stopping slightly startled. He ignored my question and continued. "You didn't like your duty here, did you? I know none of you boys do. Can't wait to go up front. But believe me, it's better here than out there. One day you'll be longing to be back." I was in no mood to comment on that remark, but I could not help asking what had been on my mind the whole time. "By the way, why are you here?" He shot a glance at me that expressed self-esteem, mockery, and total frankness. "I'm a communist, a Volksfeind. They picked me up the day the war began, and they won't let me loose before it ends. Won't be for long anymore, I guess." I felt some respect for his frankness. "It's a pity. You might have made a good soldier." He chuckled. Both his hands gripped a large wooden spoon that he continued to stir in the stew, which by now should have been ready. "Want a plateful?" he suddenly asked. "You're hungry, aren't you?" "No, not really," I lied. "Don't deny it. "You boys are always hungry," he insisted. And then, without waiting for me to reply, he put some stew on a dish and passed it to me through the fence. "You may at least have a try. It's not too bad." I instinctively took the dish. His was a simple gesture of friendliness, however undeserved, without a trace of calculation. How could I reject it? I wasn't that narrow-minded. Still, it was an awkward situation. I did my best to cover up my confusion. The stew, by the way, was good, quite a decent meal. Soon after, the men of our training company left for Finland. I was picked for additional training as an NCO, which meant another stay up at the Torrenaloch. I was taught to lead a heavy machine gun squad in action. Apart from that, the training was a rather advanced course in alpine techniques. When we were back in the valley, it was autumn. A small silver braid on my epaulets marked the end of the course. Soon I would be in combat. I wondered which division I would join. There was a 55 Mountain Division, the 7th, operating in the Balkans. Most likely, though, my assignment would be to the outfit operating near the Arctic Circle. This area had remained strange for me, cold and very far away. What I had heard of Wolf and Philippe, however, had stirred some warm feelings in me about the land and its people. I again took up my visits to Salzburg, indulging in concerts and operas. But upon returning one Sunday night, Puccini's powerful music of Madame Butterfly still ringing in my ears, and realizing that on this night I had once more been in the very centre of Europe's cultural life, I learned that my training time was coming to an abrupt end. When I passed the guardroom about midnight, the NCO on duty called me in and said, "Voss, you're on the transport leaving for Finland tomorrow morning at 6. The train had been slowing down for a while, and now came to a halt. The dim light of dawn peeked through the little openings in the walls of our boxcar, but was too weak to reveal the soldiers who stretched out under their blankets on the straw-covered floor. Dozing and still half asleep, pictures of our journey to the north came back to mind. We had reached Vienna at dusk on our first day. I had never been there before, but the name had inspired images of magnificent edifices, wide boulevards and parks, all symbols of the city's splendour. Instead, we saw only the backyards, infinitely depressing in their shabbiness and obscurity. From there, delayed by endless stops on forlorn sidings, our progress on this journey was slow. The train had wound through the hillsides of Bohemia and Moravia, occupied Czechoslovakia, and then had entered the industrial areas of Upper Silesia. Now, on the morning of our third day, we were perhaps somewhere in the plains of the Wartheland, the western part of occupied Poland. I knew only 3 or 4 of the men in the car from the course of the last 3 months. The others belonged to the recruits' training course that had followed ours. I was very glad to hear that von Hartmann was on the train, though. They said he had asked for a transfer back to his division. He was still using his stick. I rose and cautiously stepped over the bodies toward the door, which I opened just a bit to climb outside. The train had stopped between stations. The locomotive rhythmically hissed, puttered, and clanked, emitting white plumes of steam which quickly dissolved in the drizzling rain. The scene was sombre. Far ahead, dark shadows moved around the track, a repair gang apparently already at work at this early hour. No sooner had I relieved myself than the train again began to move. The few of us still outside jumped on the cars. I remained at the door, joined by a few others, curious to see the cause of our delay. Slowly, the shadows I had seen from afar took shape. They were ragged figures, 20 or 30 of them, in civilian clothes, dark and skimpy, guarded by men who wore the greatcoats of the Waffen-SS and who were armed with rifles loosely held in the crooks of their right arms. As the train crawled over the stretch under repair, I saw the faces of the gang, who had stepped back from the rails as we passed by. Horror struck me. Large black eyes in deep eye sockets, imploring and frightened, stared from pale, emaciated faces under woolen-peaked caps that looked ridiculously large. Most of them wore the yellow, six-pointed Star of David on their jackets. I shivered as I watched them lift their hands to us and timidly shout, "Herr Soldat, bitte ein Stück Brot." "Mr. Soldier, a piece of bread, please?" their spindly arms sticking out of the sleeves so that their hands appeared much too large, emphasizing their imploring gestures. These were humans at their lowest level of debasement. As the train moved slowly on, we who stood by the door wanted to give them something, but there weren't any provisions left as we were living from hand to mouth. I saw half a loaf of bread handed down from the wagon next to us, snatched up by a youngster who immediately hid it under his jacket. The train stopped again, and we could see from afar what was happening now. The youngster with the half loaf was dragged by one of his mates toward the guard next to him. As it seemed, he was ordered to hand over the bread, but refused to obey. The guard ripped the bread from him and violently flung it away. At once the youngster darted after it. He had thrown himself over his prey before he could be stopped by the sharp command, "Halt! Stehen bleiben!" which is the ultimate order before a guard shoots. The guard stepped up to him, first gesturing with his rifle to make him stand up, and then kicked him as he lay on the ground. The guard beat him with the butt of his rifle. The sight was intolerable. There were angry shouts of, "Hey! Hey! Hey!" from our wagons, even threats from those who were near. Then the rest happened quickly. From the passenger coach of our train, 2 of our officers resolutely went to the scene. The first was von Hartmann. The second one, unknown to me and much younger, followed. Approaching the guard from the side, von Hartmann shouted a command that could be heard clearly by all. "Stop that immediately! That's an order!" The guard spun, his rifle now pointed at the 2 officers. The younger officer, standing 1 step behind his senior, drew his pistol and pointed it at the guard. The confrontation lasted only seconds. The guard set down his rifle, and the pistol went back into the holster. Von Hartmann gave an order we could not understand, but without further delay, the young prisoner went over to the 2 officers. He appeared to be taken into our officers' custody. The officers turned to the train and waved the youngster to march ahead. To watch von Hartmann walking from the scene at a measured pace and with his graceful limp was deeply impressive. They stopped in front of the boxcar next to the officers' coach, handed the prisoner over to the NCO in the car, and mounted the train, which soon jerked into motion and slowly picked up speed. We closed the door and started tidying up our quarters. Those who had watched from the door told the others what had happened. All of us were glad of the interference of our officers. One of my mates said he hoped the youngster would get double rations at the next station where we would have breakfast. The incident had disturbed me deeply. Certainly in this case, and for the time being, order had been restored, but a strong feeling of uneasiness continued all the same. We reached the port of Danzig in the evening. On the train, I had been thinking of this city with growing anticipation. I had been there before, 6 years ago in 1937, together with Nick at the end of a 4-week Jungvolk hike through East Prussia. An independent German city lying in the middle of the otherwise Polish-controlled corridor artificially created by the Allies at Versailles, Danzig had long been a symbol of the humiliation inflicted on Germany after the armistice of 1918. During that summer of 1937, there had been many Jungvolk hiking groups in this region, and at the end we all had met at Danzig for a torchlight rally with fanfares and drums, a stirring experience. Since then, for me, Danzig was a town full of bright memories, of ancient houses in beautiful streets and sunlight on glittering water. Now the town was lying in the dark, and we were at war. The large ship was moored at the quay, her bow towering above our heads as we waited to embark. We would spend the night on the ship. As we stood around, von Hartmann came out of the dark, accompanied by the NCO who was in charge of the forced labourer. Seeing us, he turned to our group and greeted us quite casually. "How are our young heroes feeling? Looking forward to a cruise on the Baltic Sea?" As it happened, I was standing face to face with him. "We're feeling great," I said. "May I add, with your permission, that we were relieved when you intervened in the incident this morning?" His face grew stern. Only his eyes showed that he appreciated what was implied. "It was a severe offence against discipline," he said. "In a case like this, it's the duty of everyone to see that discipline is restored on the spot." He went on to have a few words with the next group. We were curious and asked the NCO what had happened to the Jewish youngster. "All went well," he said. The chief made a report and personally handed him over to the local authority. They were understanding. He made sure that the boy will not be sent back to his former labor unit. This incident was my first encounter with the dark side of the Third Reich, cruel and inhumane. I had seen a concrete example of what the persecution of the Jews was like, what was being done to subjects who were regarded as public enemies or as scum of the earth. At that time, however, I played down my feelings. Yes, we were aware of certain things that we thought must be changed right after the war ended. But first, we must win this war. I remember recalling then an incident my mother was teased about in the family, amusing and encouraging as well. She, as a young girl, under the eyes of people in a street at Hardenberg, furiously beat up a coachman with her umbrella to stop him from cruelly whipping his horse, which had fallen on the ground and tried in vain to stand up. That's the right spirit, I told myself when it came back to my mind on that transport, the same spirit von Hartmann had just shown, and which was shared by all who had watched. I was convinced that, in the end, this spirit would prevail. What had only been a vague feeling at that time, however, seems now established, that I had had only a glimpse into an abyss of evil. While writing down my account of the past, I am still confined to the PW camp at Romilly. By day, my companions and I are occupied with various jobs. Pete is an assistant to an American dentist, Walter a storekeeper. I interpret in the hospital cage and, recently, sometimes even in the military police station downtown, helping out the GIs with French. My life involves talking to all kinds of doctors, American soldiers and German prisoners, reading the Stars and Stripes, and, to some extent, watching the way of life in the US Army. This character of the world in which I live during the day is determined by fundamental truths that have resulted from the outcome of the war and are uncontested, as a whole, even among my German fellow prisoners. The basic truth here is that the war against Germany was a crusade against the arch-evil, embodied by Hitler and his henchmen, the SS in particular. At night, however, when I return to my writing, I enter a different world, a world with truths of its own that resulted from a period when the outcome of the war was still undecided, and wherein the arch-evil was the communist enemy in the East. Some fortitude is required to change from one world to the other, and I can never wholly escape the doubt about whether the past ought best be forgotten, since it ended in such singular catastrophe, above all for the people some thought to be inferior, but also for ourselves. Is there a more convincing proof of the falseness of all our former truths? There is another nagging doubt. Am I giving up my own self in the course of concealing my true identity as a volunteer of the Waffen-SS? Am I leaving behind the person I was, together with the dead and the outlaws, and trying to reach the other side, the land of the righteous? Am I already wandering about in a moral no-man's land? How I wish there was someone to discuss these doubts with, someone my own age who shared the same ideas, with whom I could speak in confidence. Regarding my past and my predicament, however, I am by myself in these surroundings, unable to reveal myself in the hostile atmosphere of these days. So sometimes I take to soliloquies with my alter ego, something rather intricate. Here you are, on your own now, out in the open, groping in an unknown environment for an idea of a decent future life. If you aren't prepared to defect to the land of the righteous, where then are you going, and who is your guide? It's hard for me to find my way in this new condition, where facts and values are surrounded by uncertainties and doubts, but I hope my orientation won't fail. I must rely on the old spirit. And what, my dear Voss, actually is the old spirit? And what is it telling you now? Hold fast to the old values, despite all those horrible revelations, or feel sorry for yourself for the rest of your life. Aren't you too young for that? No, neither way. Not blind loyalty, but not total abjuration either. Not of the basic values, at least. And don't give in to self-pity. What is still valid, I think, is loyalty to one's country. So one must continue to serve one's country. I'll do my best under the circumstances. Do I abandon my old self by proceeding as such? No, certainly not. It sounds convincing as a general rule, but remember where your service has gotten you and your country. Who would dare say today that you and the old spirit served your country well? Don't get me confused now with our former leadership. All right, your service didn't cause the catastrophe, but it was instrumental to it, wasn't it? That doesn't say much. It's true of any military service if you agree that the war itself was a catastrophe from the outset. All the same, you said continue to serve. First of all, there won't be any continuation. If at all, we must start from zero. Whatever it is, it's we who continue to be, the ones who are left. And the land that is left, and from which we'll have to continue to wring a living, our country. All right, but how do you think it could work in practice? Your country will have to be some sort of organized community, and most probably the rules of that community will be inconsistent with our old self, maybe a country you won't even want to serve. Don't forget, you are an outlaw, and judging from the newspapers, it seems likely that the new country too will regard you as such. Still bound by the old loyalty to the old spirit, no need for crossing the line. We'll see what can be rescued of the old spirit. At least it won't be inconsistent with the responsibility our country must take on for what has been done to the inferiors. I am quite confident there will be new causes that are worth the effort. I'll have to make my choice when the time is there. We had to make choices before, hadn't we? Besides, I rather thought of a modest, inconspicuous way to serve, the way we did before. Well, let's leave it at that for the time being. Discussions with my companions are different. They are more abstract, more philosophical. Normally, at our age, the three of us would be at university now, and of course they start from the new verities. Nevertheless, they are helping me to find my way. Only last Sunday afternoon, Pete, Walter and I had another one of these discussions, when Pete and I returned from our Greek lessons with the Protestant chaplain. Walter is Austrian, or to be more precise, a Viennese, tall, haggard, with a distinct aquiline nose between deep-set, almost black eyes that made me think of Paganini when I first met him. He was called up for service straight after leaving school. Walter is the intellectual among us. He has a piercing analytical mind, is well-read, and in my opinion a cynic. Pete is different in almost every way. Coming from a Hamburg family, he is sturdy, strong, blonde with blue eyes, a believer rather than an intellectual, optimistic compared to Walter, who always leans toward the gloomy side. When Pete and I entered our tent, back from our lesson, we were received by Walter with one of his typical sarcasms. "Ah, our disciples of Greek are back. Are our educational aspirations satisfied for today? I hope our distinguished teacher has brought us safely through the Greek alphabet." Walter was lying on his field cot, hands clasped behind his neck, meditating as usual. Without turning his head towards us, he continued, "I wonder what you think you'll gain from Greek. Believe me, it's of no use. At least it's been of no use to me. On the contrary, my education kept me from learning English. Do I owe my steep career climb in this cage from storeman to storekeeper to Greek? Not that I know of. Was it of any use to me in the army? No, sir, on the contrary again. I learned very quickly never to mention my knowledge of Greek, not even that I had been a student at the gymnasium. As for me, there's a simple practical reason." Pete took up Walter's skepticism. "I want to know the roots of so many medical terms derived from Greek. I'm certain it'll help me a lot at university." "Maybe yes. And what about you, Johann? Also interested in etymology? It's not as obvious as with Pete." "Well, no, you're right, although it's obvious that you need something to occupy your mind with," I replied rather lamely. I had no desire to let myself be drawn into another one of our discussions that often turned acid. "What?" Walter exploded. "Need to occupy your mind? My dear Johann, I don't know how to unload my mind from the heap of problems that keep troubling me. Can you explain to me, for instance, how it could happen that I am stuck in this goddamned cage, although I did everything to stay out of the mess? How did all of this come about? What were the mechanisms at work? Those are only some of the questions my mind is occupied with day and night." "Don't think, Walter, you're the only one troubled with these questions," I replied. "Privileged as you are with knowing Greek, however, I'd think the philosophers would make it easy for you to solve your problems. Are you thinking of someone in particular?" Plato's state just crossed my mind. The chaplain and I talked about it the other day. Little as I know of him, I would think that you could find some answers there. Wasn't he born into a war as we were? And didn't he know from experience that an individual cannot exist except within a community, and that in turn the individual owes certain obligations to the state so that both will survive? I think that's an answer to your question, isn't it? It's a wisdom as old as philosophy. It's a strong argument for Greek, by the way. Old and rotten, Walter retorted passionately, rising from his cot. The idea of the individual as a subordinate of the state is the root of all evil in the history of man. It's the same with the church. It always ended with the oppression of man by the ruling class in the name of some higher entity. The Enlightenment put reason in the place of the authority of the church. The French Revolution restored the natural freedom of the individual, his freedom from state authorities. All in vain. Somehow the old institutions and patronage returned or prevailed. Incredible but true. If the state would only ensure that everybody can look after his own interests, all would be fine. Harmony would be the result, brought about by the invisible hand of reason. You ever heard about the invisible hand of reason? That's the wisdom of the modern age. Plato's state, my dear Johann, is dead. Walter sat down on Pete's field cot opposite mine, ready for a new round of discussion. I'm no expert in this. I don't know whether Plato's ideas are dead in the world of philosophy, I said, but I do know they are alive in the real world. Aren't we constantly dealing with national states and their endless rivalries, and, in the last decades, also with aggressive organizations like the Comintern? The question is, how to prevail in this world where insoluble issues are fought out in wars. Individual freedom is fine, as long as there is peace. You can't prevail, though, can't fight or prepare for a war on the basis of individualism. If everybody only looks after his own personal interests, a state cannot exist, nor can a nation. Both will perish in the world of reality, and with them the rest of your personal freedom you can only enjoy within an organized community. Thank goodness there are people who feel there are values that reach beyond one's own self, and that are worth sacrificing some of one's precious individuality. You just won't learn, Walter replied. If it weren't for people like you, always eager to make sacrifices for the so-called common good, people like Hitler or Stalin would never succeed. You are nothing. Your people are all that matter. That's what you were taught in the Reich. It's the philosophy of all totalitarian systems. They depend on people like you. The evil lies with the idealists. God save us from the faithful, the patriots, the do-gooders. It was not Walter's first challenge, but this time it was unmistakably serious. He was glaring at me with flashing eyes, waiting for me to reply. Now you are talking nonsense, Walter. It's not the philosophy of totalitarian systems. It's true of all states. Neither Churchill nor Roosevelt could have waged war without suspending individual freedom and relying on the idealists to whom I gladly profess allegiance. With individualists, both would have lost their war long since, which I'm afraid is not quite what you had in mind, I added accusingly. I can see no virtue in individualism, nor reason. In the world we are living in, it comes down to egoism, selfishness. What is the opinion of a medic on that? I added, seeing that the discussion with Walter wouldn't get us anywhere. Well, coming from a practicing Protestant family, I must raise objections against both of your attitudes, Pete began. I don't know what to do with the state, the common good, the invisible hand of reason, liberalism, and all that. A Christian simply wants to help his fellow human beings. Love thy neighbour is the guiding principle. Doing that, you have to make sacrifices, to give away much of your personal interests and freedom. It's quite natural. Yes, there will always be sacrifices for goals that reach beyond your own self, but in the name of God rather than in the name of the people, which is a questionable authority. And then, yes, there must be freedom of the individual, freedom to act as a Christian. As long as you are aware of that, I mean of serving God, you are secure from sacrifices in the name of evil and from egoism and selfishness. It's all quite simple. He smiled at us. It's too simple, Walter said. Must I enumerate all the evil done in the world in the name of Christianity? There is no security against abuse as long as man will continue to act in the name of some higher authority. First subordination, then devotion and slavish obedience, fanaticism, inquisition, security police, and in the end, slavery and death for all who want to resist. It's so obvious after all we have been through. No more altruism, Christian or national, no more idealists, for these are the elements of collectivism, which is the arch-enemy of individual freedom and is the reason why I am here. Sophism, Walter, pure sophism, Pete protested. With that, you won't overthrow the basic principles of Christian religion. It's so obvious to me that it is a natural virtue of man to want to serve a cause that reaches beyond his own self. Of course, it must be safeguarded against abuse, namely by the conscience, sharpened by the principles of our religion. The safeguard of conscience may fail with the weak, but it is there. It's the true and natural authority within ourselves. I have severe reservations too, Walter, I said. Nothing of your chain of events was bound to happen, nor were there events linked together by altruism and idealism. There always were so many factors and vectors involved, each oscillating continuously from weak to strong, that any outcome, the obvious as well as the inconceivable, is possible. I simply can't accept the view that with National Socialism it was clear from the outset where it would end. Anything could have happened, even peace after the Anschluss, and perhaps even after our campaign in Poland and France. All the same, one lesson is clear. Never again must there be any public authority without active popular control. In writing down the details of this discussion, it becomes quite clear there is much truth in Pete's view. There must be some reasonable combination of altruism and individualism to combat both egoism and collectivism. The core of individual freedom must be preserved under all circumstances, even in war, and there must be no such thing as unconditional commitment. I think that is the lesson we learned from our experience. Perhaps partly out of an intellectual thirst and partly from a desire for more congenial surroundings, I suddenly wished I were at Hardenberg in my grandmother's library to have a closer look into Plato's state and into the philosophers of the Enlightenment. The messenger stood before us. We hadn't noticed him in the twilight that enveloped the snow-covered woodland. The motionless white figure seemed a mere part of the frozen environment, leaning against a fur, helmet and parka covered with a hooded snowshirt, his right arm resting on the black barrel of the machine pistol that hung horizontally under his shoulder. Even now, pushing himself off the trunk and coming closer, his face could barely be seen. Only his eyes were visible under the brim of his helmet as he watched our small group. We were assembled on the path leading to the front line. I started to report, name, rank, and assignment. The messenger made a motion of his hand to indicate that I should lower my voice. He spoke softly when he greeted us, and shook hands with me and the other 4 replacements. I was to go with him to the Hauptkampflinie, HKL, the main combat line, but first we had to take the other 4 to the Mungo emplacement, which was nearby. He pointed to the right where the path disappeared between the birch trees and the firs around the foot of the little hill. It was the first time I heard mortars called Mungos. As we were taking up our gear, one of our group let his rifle butt clank against his metal gas mask container. The messenger quickly stepped up to the man, took his rifle off his back, arranged it under his right shoulder so that the barrel pointed down, and gently laid the man's hand on top. I understood that the Russians were within earshot. And now, for the first time on this day, I noticed how still everything was around us, a frozen stillness that seemed to be the very nature of this strange terrain. The messenger motioned the group to the path, and we set off in single file for the Mungo emplacement. He pointed up the hill. "Right over there behind it is the HKL," he said. On the hill, the thin stand of firs and birches stood out, still and black, from the snow and the semi-darkness of the sky. The mortar platoon emplacement was almost invisible. Only when standing in front of a ditch leading to an entrance did I realize that the flat mound on top of the burrow was the top of a snow-covered bunker. The messenger and my 4 companions disappeared in the first bunker, leaving me waiting outside for a while. We had come with the mules. From the rear echelon up to here, it had been a march of about 2 hours, trudging along the supply trail in single file. The mules accompanied us with their warm smell, their soft snorts, and the creaking of the wicker baskets that swung at their sides in the rhythm of their steady pace. After a while, I was lulled into a semi-hypnotic state, strangely possessed by a monotonous song I had heard at Oulu, the seaport, trivially romantic stuff. In Oulu da sind wir gelandet, unsere Triume versanken im Meer. It expressed the sentiments of those who saw themselves, against all their zealous expectations, banished to the ass of the earth, as this remote Arctic region generally was regarded. For the last kilometre we had been on our own. The mule drivers had stayed back and described the way to the spot where we would meet the messenger. And yet, standing here in the darkness at this strange place, I felt I hadn't arrived yet. I was still somewhere in between a former and a future existence. I had seen the contrast of both when, more than a week ago, we were putting out to sea and were watching the coast of East Prussia disappear in the night. I had been there, at that coast, 6 years ago, in the sun on the beach of Palmnicken with Nick and the other boys of our hiking group. I was diving for amber then, in the surf again and again, and I would throw the pieces I had found on the hot sand, proud and full of joy. Now, leaving the coast on a troop ship, I understood that now it wasn't time for fun on the beach. It was a time to serve, a time of duty. It was as if I was leaving somebody back on that coast, an old acquaintance of mine whom I hadn't seen for quite a while. There were other strange moments on the way to the front. When our ship was manoeuvring through the marvels of the archipelago off Loku, and we were looking over the railing down on the numerous green islands adorned with little red-painted huts and boats. When we were amused at the toy-like, wood-fired locomotive that was to take our train to the north, and when, eventually, after our arrival at the port of Oulu, we were sitting in our huts together with our comrades. All were but fleeting phrases in the prelude to my new life. There, at our base at Oulu, we had received our new equipment, winter uniform items in particular. The camp was in a grove at the outskirts of the little town. The camp was comprised of dispersed huts, and the aromatic smell of wood smoke filled the air. The first snow of the early winter decked the ground throughout the camp. In the few evenings, while waiting for our transport, we sat in the canteen, drinking and singing, sometimes being joined by some of the veterans of our division's motorized infantry battalion, SS Scheitzen Eotoil on 6, located in reserve there. On the third morning, I had seen off the first batch of replacements to the front. They were a resolute pack of young volunteers sitting in the rear of the trucks, with eager faces under their helmets, framed by the fur-lined hoods of their parkas, rifles upright between their knees. The chance of running into one of them or someone of my former training company out there was small. Another farewell then, some brave smiles, some waving, and the transport quickly vanished into the whirling snow. Cigarette? I spun around, facing the messenger who silently had returned from the bunker. My reverie was over. Thanks! I lighted a match for him, cupping the flame. For the first time, I could see his features more closely. He had a pleasant, clean-shaven young face and light hair. He was only 2 or 3 years older than I, but looked seasoned. Under his half-opened parka, I could see the ribbon of the Iron Cross. "Welcome again," he said in his soft way of speaking that I'd become accustomed to. "You know it's the heavy machine gun company of our battalion you're going to, the 14th. The gun I'll bring you to is integrated in the sector of the other mountain infantry regiment in our division, pretty near the Ivan, hardly 150 metres distant. Over there is our company command post," he continued, pointing in the direction opposite the Mungo emplacement. "The chief wants to see you in the morning. I'll take you there." Turning ahead, he pointed to the left. "Over there is a lake. That's where the sector of our regiment ends towards the north. On the other side of the lake, the positions of our sister regiment begin, stretching farther up to the north and ending nowhere, in the swamps and lakes with only some strong points. That's the north flank, which was a common expression with us. And over there, to the right, runs the road to Luki. The road, as we call it. That's where other parts of our regiment are positioned, on both sides of it. I nodded to all he had said, but I must have looked somewhat perplexed. I had understood nothing. All I could perceive was that the division's positions were concealed somewhere in this snow-covered, thinly wooded environment. "You'll figure it out for yourself before long," he said. We put out our cigarettes. "Let's go, and be quiet. There are snipers over there, even when it's dark." He went ahead, along the path up the hill. Suddenly I heard a pistol shot. A flare hissed skyward, quivering high above the ground and casting a tremulous white magnesium light over the sparse birch trees and conifers. Black stripes shaded the snow. Both of us stood frozen on the flat top of the hill, he from experience and I from awe. Now I could see that the slope ended in a depression, which extended toward a hill opposite ours. I tried in vain to discover the enemy positions the messenger said were only 150 meters away. The flare went out and another soared up. At that moment, further down on our side, a machine pistol opened up, firing 2 short bursts. Then the sustained fire of a machine gun followed. Immediately all hell broke loose. From the opposite hill, 2 machine guns opened fire. To the left, another one of our machine guns joined in. I remained standing upright in the shade of a tree, just as if I were a bystander, uninvolved in what was happening in front of us, only that there were strange sounds all around me. "Peer! Peer! Patch oying! Oying! Patch! Peer!" "Take cover! Hit the ground, man!" the messenger shouted. He was lying flat in a small hollow. I came down the same second, suddenly realizing that we were amidst the scattered fire of a Russian machine gun that was raking the surface of the hill and hitting the trunks with sharp smacks. It dawned on me that I had just escaped an early death, a stupid and entirely useless one. "Over here!" the messenger shouted. With a few jumps I was at his side. Down in front, short burps of submachine guns mixed with the other small arms fire. The messenger cursed. He pointed down the slope. "Over there! The ditch! We must be in there before they start off with their mungos. I'll jump first. You follow me right away," he hissed. When the messenger darted off, I heard the mortar discharges on the other side. "Pop! Pop! Pop! Pop!" I waited. Then the bursts of the first round came hurrying up the slope. Wham! 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 In rapid succession. "Now! Quick!" the messenger yelled, and up I jumped and landed beside him in the ditch. The reality of the HKL was tougher and crueler than I had imagined, reminding me of the surprise in my boxing lessons in the Jungwolk camp when I got hit full in the face for the first time. More mortar fire followed, with shells bursting all over the hill, and there were more firings on both sides in between. Pop, 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 pop. But the messenger, disregarding the turmoil, rushed forward along the system of ditches we were in now, ducking and running, while I kept stumbling and panting behind. Suddenly, hearing the swish of another shell, quite close, we took cover on the floor of the ditch. Instantly, I was shocked by the blast of the shell bursting right on the parapet. When I came to, the messenger was kneeling beside me. "You all right?" "Yes, quite all right, I think." "It's over," he said. I got up and looked over the parapet where the impact had torn a dirty gap, but the woodland around us was dark and still as before. I felt a sharp pain behind my left ear and realized that when I had thrown myself down on the floor, I had been hit hard by the butt of my rifle. The bunker was right behind the next corner. A curved ditch led down to the entrance. A few steps and we stopped short in front of the crude door. We could hear a tune being played on a harmonica coming from within. The messenger grinned and pushed the door open. Nobody was there except for a fire guard slowly emerging from the dark background and casually knocking out his instrument in his palm. "You're a fine one, playing your harmonica while hell is breaking loose outside," the messenger said, and shook hands with the black-haired, sturdy man. "It's just because of the noise," he said with a broad grin. "Gets on my nerves. And whom do we have here? Our replacement, I guess." "Right, it's Johann Voss, and this is Heinz Baumer, Rifleman 3 on this gun." We shook hands. I had a look around. It was a dugout built for 7, warmed by a small stove and lit by a carbide lamp that gave off a blue-white light and a pungent smell. In the back, squeezed under the low ceiling of thick logs, were some bunk beds, crudely joined together by spruce sticks and sprigs. The side walls were also solid blocks of logs. There was a neat gun rack, a little table, and 2 benches around it. On the walls all sorts of equipment were stashed: ammunition, clothes, felt boots, and among others 2 expended artillery shell casings connected with the outside by a string. The others returned in a moment. First in was a group of 3 with white-covered helmets, their faces flushed with excitement and all armed to the teeth. They squeezed themselves through the narrow entrance with easy, practiced movements. The silver runes on their right collar patches glinted in the light of the carbide lamp. They were all talking at the same time, animated by the short fight. I gathered that a Russian patrol must have been lying for hours in the snow, not far in front of our positions, to wait for its chance to jump into our ditch. One of the 3 who had just come in, a blonde one called Schmidtchen, recounted in a strong, calm accent how he had been on guard, had fired the flares, and then was lucky enough to kill the first one of the patrol. The Russian had jumped up right in front of him, but entangled his submachine gun in his own snow shirt, enabling Schmidtchen to get the better of him. The other Russians had been caught by our machine gun fire, and with their attacks stalled, the rest had taken flight, probably with some casualties. The 3 of them removed their helmets and stashed their rifles into the rack. 2 others were still out in the ditch, one they called Der Alte, the old one, and their first gunner named Heinrich. I was standing in the background by a bunk. They hadn't noticed me. Then I saw Der Alte coming in. A submachine gun hung across his lean figure. A pair of deep-set eyes peered out under the brim of his steel helmet, and a wide mouth formed 2 strong parallel lines above a square jaw. It was a face like a woodcut. "Attention!" he called while he slowly filled his 2 pouches with new magazines for his machine pistol. "Order of the chief. You stay as you are, all of you. No taking off your boots, no sleeping, absolutely no schnapps. The Ivan might try again before long." He had spoken in a calm, commanding voice salted by a very strong Upper Silesian dialect, his protrusive Adam's apple bobbing up and down his long throat. He was the leader of this gun section, about 25 years old, one of the old guard who had joined up before the war. Just as I was going to report to him, he spotted me. "Hey, soldier, who are you?" The others, too, then noticed me. The messenger had already left. I went forward, saluted, and reported for duty. His salute was casual. A thin smile went over his face. Perhaps my report had turned out a bit too snappily for these wizened combat veterans. He sized me up. Both of us were feeling the certain difference between the old and the young volunteers. His manner was neither cold nor warm. His nickname, though, appeared quite appropriate to me, as he obviously was the oldest and the most seasoned of the squad. His stern, nutcracker face also matched with the name. He seemed to enjoy a considerable natural respect among the men of his squad. "Put your things on the bunk in the upper left. In case of an alarm, don't come out, under any circumstances." And turning to the others, "Take care of him." I shook hands with the others and answered their questions about my personal and military backgrounds. Such was my first encounter with the front line. I arrived in a still forest, experienced an explosion of violence, and had a friendly reception in the bunker. The vague notions about my new assignment now had found their form: the land, the front, and the faces of my new comrades. Here, in this setting of icy marshes and swamps, of snow-covered woodland, of brooks and lakes, of a front line clutching at a forlorn slope and ribs of land at the 66th degree north latitude, the Arctic Circle, I had met what would from now on be my home, my life, and my fate, the 3rd Battalion. A terrible bang jolted me from a deep sleep. I was on the upper bunk in our dugout. It was the 6th day of December in 1943. Feeling a piercing pain, I realized I had bumped my forehead against the log ceiling. Above the bunk next to me, the roof had been ripped open. A big hole let in the dim light of a subarctic noon. A Russian anti-tank gun was blasting away on our position and had torn apart the thick layers of logs, stones and dirt on the top of our bunker. The gun's reports were fast, dry and hard, instantly followed by the impacts of the shells. Inside our bunker, the expended shell casings, jerked by the string from our MG emplacement, jangled their maddening alarm. Still numb, I jumped into my felt boots, getting ready to rush outside. The alarm stopped, and at the same moment I heard our own machine gun opening fire. Then the Mungos on the other side began firing. Pop! 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 Sending over shell after shell that plastered the ground around us. The Alter, already in his parka and with his helmet on, was grabbing his submachine gun. With quick, measured movements, he stuffed his pockets full of hand grenades. "Folks, it's getting serious! Come on out, quick!" he shouted and dashed outside. Heinrich was right behind him, both on their way to the machine gun emplacement. I followed with the others, running along the ditch, always ducking from the mortar fire. Orders were unnecessary in a situation like this. Each knew his place. Mine was next to Heinrich as number 2 gunner. At our machine gun bunker, Baumer was blasting away in short bursts, swivelling the gun on its tripod, mounting. The anti-tank gun was silent. It had disappeared behind its camouflage. The Russian Mungos went on firing. Ours, 81, 82 Black Edelweiss, had joined in too. We could see their rounds impact on the enemy's position. The roof of our emplacement had been hit by the Russian anti-tank gun, but neither Baumer nor our machine gun were harmed. Together with one of the 12th Company's machine guns, he had repelled an assault of a Russian patrol to the left of our gun position. When Heinrich and I took over, we could see some white-clad figures withdrawing, every other second jumping up, running, and quickly taking cover again in a deep trail they had flattened in the snow, while stealthily creeping forward all night. 3 bundles remained lying in the snow, indistinct, not far from our barbed wire entanglement. The firing stopped for a while. The white patrol disappeared into a stand of spruce and birches. Quickly we changed the hot barrel. I took another belt from the ammunition box and loaded it into the breech of the gun. "Everyone all right here?" a voice behind us asked. I turned around. The officer on duty had entered our bunker. With him was Oberscharführer Schäper, our platoon leader. The two were in full gear, submachine guns across their chests, white-covered helmets on. They couldn't have been more different in appearance, though. The officer, Untersturmführer Manhard, was a platoon leader in the 12th Company of our regiment. I had never really spoken to him. He was a handsome man, lean and young, about Philip's age. When he walked through the trenches, it was with a markedly springy gait. Now, in the narrowness of the bunker, I saw his face close up, and noticed under the rim of his helmet eyes that were full of willpower and resolution as they peered out through the embrasure. Schäper, on the other hand, was sturdily built, ruddy-faced, a man from a village in Lower Saxony. He clearly was another one of the old guard. He also had a remarkable gait that always reminded me of a farmer trudging in rubber boots across a rain-soaked field of sugar beets. "Yes, so far, Untersturmführer," the Alter said. Manhard was in a hurry, pressing on with questions. How many we had seen, how many casualties left in the field, what sort of equipment were they carrying? Most importantly, where was the anti-tank gun? The Alter pointed to a spot directly across the hollow. "Right over there, just beside their machine gun bunker. I've never seen that son of a bitch around here before. Can't be much of an emplacement. Guess they've done it overnight. It happened all of a sudden. Baumer here had them right in his telescopic sight when they tore down the camouflage from the gun and started banging away." Manhard stepped up to the rabbit-ear trench scope and searched the opposite hill for the gun. "They tried the same stunt with the 1st Battalion a few weeks ago," he said. "What do you think they're up to?" the Alter asked. "Don't know yet. A probe, I guess. Whatever. I think they'll try again before long, and then I'm afraid your emplacement will be their first target. Listen, at this distance they'll blow the whole bunker away with that gun if you let them. Make sure they don't get another chance. You must silence that gun before it starts doing real harm. Don't let them out of your sight. I'll request special fire support from our Mungos." With that, he departed. We were waiting while the Alter remained glued to the scope, now and again traversing it slowly to the right and to the left. Heinrich peered over his sight. More than an hour passed in silence, tense and threatening. The 3 bundles in front of the wire remained still. Noon was over, and it was getting dark again, as dark as it gets at this snow-covered latitude. The cold slowly crept up from the ground to my knees, despite my thick boots and the brushwood underneath. Heinrich took a break, leaving the gun to me. No sooner had he left than I saw their gun right across from us as it slowly appeared from behind a screen being torn down and then loomed over the parapet, aimed at our firing position. "There it is!" the Alter and I yelled at the same time. "Fire!" the Alter yelled. The first burst of tracers arced over. I had the Russian piece firmly in my sight and kept the trigger handle tightly pressed. I could imagine the bullets cracking against the shield of their gun and rattling the nerves of the gunners, but penetrate their armour they did not even at the range of only 150 metres. Then came their response. The first round slammed into the roof of our emplacement, tearing away another part of it. The second round was too short. If the next one went through the embrasure, we'd have had it. Heinrich was back and took over, keeping the Russian gunners pinned down by long bursts of fire. Their third shot also missed, but the duel of life and death wasn't over yet. Then, finally, our mortars started firing. I saw a rapid sequence of impacts around our target, 4 at a time. Another round and then more. The Alter kept watching through his telescope, getting more and more excited about our well-placed mungo fire. "Cease fire, Heinrich!" he called suddenly. "Don't see the gun any more. I think it's busted." We had a break. We had no sooner changed the barrel, though, when Heinrich discovered a second Russian patrol, quite distant yet, but coming from the same direction. He swung his gun around, aiming at the white shadows working their way forward in the twilight. "Hold it!" the Alter said. "We'll get them at closer range." Suddenly he yelled, "Watch out!" At the same time, the burp of a Russian submachine gun sounded right in front of us, followed by the Alter emptying a whole magazine of his submachine gun right above my head. One of the 3 Russians lying in front of our wire had crept forward, waited for his chance, and, trying to accomplish what had gone wrong before, had leapt to his feet. The Alter had spotted him almost too late, but shot him just in time. The Russian soldier collapsed, his body twisting as one arm became caught in the barbed wire. Then he lay still, his arm remaining raised as if in remonstration against his own useless act of bravery. At the same time, our defensive fire broke loose. Heinrich blasted away with his gun, and our mortars plastered the no-man's land. The Ivans had advanced pretty far, but for all their bravery, their patrol had to fall back. All of a sudden, our mortars stopped firing. "Hey, look!" the Alter shouted. "I think the 12th is going after them. Can't believe it. These devils!" I jumped up, and looking through the embrasure, I could see the shadows of our men dashing over the white treeless expanse at the left of our hill and in an oblique direction toward the patrol. They had come rather close and were already about to cut the Russian patrol in 2. I heard Manhard's command, loud and clear, ordering the men on his left flank to wheel around and block the Russians' withdrawal. All went very quickly then. Shooting and storming, they broke through the patrol in no time, herded the last of the Ivans together, and were already well on their way back with them before the Russian Mungos opened fire. Afterwards, the forest was as still and as dark as it had been in the morning. It was late afternoon, and I remained on guard for the next hour. The Alter came by to tell us there were no casualties on our side. As I inhaled deeply on my first cigarette, the tension gave way to the feeling that this was the place where I wanted to be in this time of war. Upon my return to the bunker, the men were in high spirits. Mail had arrived. Under the circumstances of our crowded dwelling, it was inevitable that mail, to a certain extent, was a public affair rather than a retreat into privacy. A bottle of cognac, part of the monthly ration for each of us, was standing next to the carbide lamp. Letters and photographs were passed around. Some of the men were still cleaning their weapons. I was met with a special welcome since I had received a parcel from home, and everybody knew they would somehow participate. When I opened it, I could hardly believe my eyes. It was a St. Nicholas parcel from home with everything in it that used to be in our shoes on the morning of the 6th of December when we were children. Biscuits, nuts, chocolate, twigs of spruce with red bows, and some little gift, a knife, a notebook, or what have you. This time it was a small book, Hamsun, Under Autumn Stars. To think that this parcel had reached me over the distance of 4,000 kilometres, by ship, by train, by truck, and on the backs of mules, and that it had arrived in time on the very day, all that was a near miracle. Outside, the frost had increased. The little stove roared, its top red hot. Our spirits escalated after another bottle of cognac had come to the table. At first, the altar dominated the scene by starting the songs to be sung, telling jokes, ordering others to tell jokes, and showing approval or contempt depending on the degree of filthiness. Know the story of the 2 fleas? He started once more. No, you don't? Well, here it is. 2 fleas meet in the beard of a motorcyclist. Like it here, says the one. Well, one gets around, but every time he rides there's this awful, dreadful draught, drives me crazy. Well, if you want my advice, find a young woman and nestle in her bosom as soon as possible. It's a fine life there, I can tell you, calm and warm. And that's what the other flea actually did. One day it was gone, but a few weeks later it was back again. How did you fare, my dear friend? You followed my advice? Yes, indeed. I crawled into the bosom of a young beauty, and I had a wonderful time there, just as you said. But one day I discovered an even better place not far away, one that was bushy, warm and cosy, absolutely splendid, magnificent. Good to hear. But tell me, why didn't you stay? Well, I don't know. One day somehow I found myself back in the beard. There was a roar of laughter. Heinrich and I were somewhat more subdued. In general, filthy jokes were not so much in favour among us younger ones. All the more reason for another round of cognac and another song. Baumer on his harmonica started a doleful melody, a favourite of Schmidtchen's, the song of a poacher, his daughter, and his master, who, after a couple of verses, eventually all died. Schmidtchen loved that kind of song.